Good evening, everybody. Welcome. We're going to wait just a minute or two for a few others to join us. You're welcome to come on and off of the microphone if you'd like to introduce yourselves or share anything about your current interest in CDI as we get started. If you're looking to learn more about CDI and how CDI works in hospital settings, you're in the right place. Today we'll be talking a little bit about the purpose of CDI, if you don't already know, as well as some focus topics for today, which are the skills, strategies, and certifications that are essential for success in the industry. I am the host for today and the presenter. My name is Tarman Aziz. I'm an internal medicine physician by training, and I've worked in the CDI space for the past 13 years now, both in CDI operations and as a hospital revenue cycle and quality consultant. I've had extensive experience with inpatient CDI operations, also from a physician documentation champion perspective. So I can speak to several aspects of CDI, from really the most entry level of positions all the way through management of programs. And it's a pleasure for me to see you all here today and signing up for these. We'll be having these monthly to help focus on different elements of the CDI profession, and to make sure that we answer all of your questions along the way about what we offer in terms of training programs. You can see I work with a team here, our Chief Operating Officer, Anna Rosanowski, who has an extensive background in contracting and also in business development and marketing. And we have a support team as well that helps us with so much of what we do in a day. So thank you to them also. Today, our agenda is very focused on the advertised topic of effective CDI strategies, CDI workflow, and key certifications. And I want to allow ample time at the end for your questions, and I can provide some answers to those, hopefully, so that you can feel adequately informed as to whether this is the right field for you. I wonder if anyone in the chat box might share with us if you are already in the CDI profession, or if you even want to come on the microphone. You're certainly welcome to. There's no restriction to your questions. I hope that you will ask questions throughout the presentation rather than it having the setting of just a speech from me. That really doesn't work as well. Anybody at all already in the CDI profession?
Hi, my name's Colleen Roth. I was system coding manager for a very large hospital for a long time and was just recently laid off in a very large hospital merger layoff. And I'm thinking I want to go the CDI route. I was an inpatient coder for 20 years before I managed the coding department in and out. And I've worked heavily with CDI, and back in the 90s when it first started, I took a course, a 30-week course with them when they trained the whole hospital. So, that's my main. I have a CCS. I'll probably go for the CDIP.
Very good. We'll talk about certification later. And welcome, Colleen. Thank you for coming on the microphone to introduce yourself. I do believe we also interacted via LinkedIn.
Yes.
Sometime quite recently. So that's great. Anybody else interested in saying a quick hello, who you are, where you come from, what your aspirations or interests might be?
Good evening. My name is Sarah, and I currently do work in CDI. I am an outpatient CDI in New York for a large hospital institution. I've been part of the department for now almost 4 years. And I'm happy that I found you on LinkedIn through someone mutual who reposted your training for tonight, or your
Oh,
webinar for tonight.
oh, very good. I'm glad to have you here and welcome as well. Good to know you already have that outpatient perspective, and maybe you'll be interested in thinking about inpatient as well. I see a chat entry. You're not in a CDI position, Alicia. That's okay. Welcome to you as well. But you do have that background in both nursing and RHIT. Wonderful preparation also for a career in inpatient CDI operations, as well as the related careers to that. So thank you as well. We can go ahead and get started unless anybody else wanted to come and introduce themselves. It's a small enough group, we can do that if you'd like. If not, maybe you'll join in a little bit later. So let's go through and talk first about, we will get to the strategies, workflow, certification piece for today, but let's start by discussing what CDI is all about first, for those of you that maybe don't know or want to know a little bit more from our perspective. So inpatient CDI programs are there to ensure that the patient stay, from a documentation standpoint, accurately reflects a patient's clinical status. We're talking about how severely ill are these patients, first and foremost, and secondarily, what is their chance of potentially passing away in the hospital during their stay? And if not that, we may be focused on the chances of being readmitted to the hospital far too soon than we would hope for, or perhaps predicting a longer length of stay in the hospital. It turns out that provider documentation drives a lot of that in terms of what can be picked up by coders and ultimately billed for a given stay. But the billing is only part of it. As you see in this first bullet point, there are also quality ramifications involved here, quality reporting details that need to be considered. And so we can really think carefully then about the um, different types of uh, impacts that you might see to public health and to continuity of patient care, as well as, of course, reimbursement in the hospital. So CDI stresses that, particularly in the provider assessment and plan. Those of you that have already had an insight into inpatient CDI know that there's not a whole lot we can do sometimes about entries in the problem list. We don't know if they're outdated. So we really ask providers most of the time to firm up the documentation in their assessment and plan portion of the notes for inpatient stays to make sure that we get the right type of diagnoses put through to coding and to billing. So now the most important thing to remember is that to do well in CDI, you need to become comfortable with the idea of a diagnosis-related group. A diagnosis-related group represents a group of conditions that cost the hospital a similar amount of resource utilization. In other words, to treat the patient, we have a rather predictable amount of resources to be used. And each of those diagnosis-related groups have a certain weighting factor called a relative weight that will be used to help determine reimbursement in the first instance. Many of the diagnoses that make up the final DRG assignment at the time of discharge will also go on to have an impact to that case's quality metrics and quality impact to public reporting for the hospital, as well as other key performance indicators for the providers. Some of the terms that you would become familiar with, if not already, case mix index. The case mix index is actually the average of all of those weights that I just referred to, those relative weights. The sicker a patient is, the more likely that their DRG weighting number that's used to determine reimbursement will be a higher number. And if a patient were to have a surgical procedure, you can ensure even a higher number than that will be involved. So the more ill or the more surgical procedures, the higher the relative weights. Those are averaged out over a typical period of either a month or sometimes quarterly to give a number called a case mix index, which is used for a number of things. But two important ones to think about tonight are how sick is the patient population that you treated during that period of time? And secondly, what was the revenue for the facility? Remember that providers are paid a professional fee for their services, but facilities also receive a fee for each and every hospital stay. And that's the important piece. We hope that doctors will write their notes up in a way that they serve their facility well, because we're not looking in CDI for extra money. That's a big misconception. In CDI, we're looking for appropriate reimbursement for what the hospital actually had to utilize to treat a patient from admission all the way through to discharge. CDI specialists have the purview of looking at the medical record from just almost at the very beginning of the inpatient stay, perhaps only 1.5 to 2 days into the stay. You may begin reviewing the records in real time, looking at what the providers are writing down in their assessments and plans so that you can determine if there are any deficiencies in that documentation based on your insights, looking through the medical record, considering all of the laboratory data, all of the entries from different providers, radiographic data, other supporting information, and determining if there are other diagnoses that perhaps are not being represented in the most ideal way on that medical record. The goal is never to have a very sick patient who actually looks quite healthy on paper because the provider has not given enough specificity in how they've written up those notes. So that's a broad overview. There's, of course, a lot more to it than that, but that's just a brief introduction. And as certain types of comorbid conditions begin to accumulate on the chart, of course, everybody is admitted to the hospital for one primary reason, the condition that's so-called bought the bed, rather than being sent home or put into observation status. And so there will always be a principal diagnosis. But as you start to appropriately document additional comorbidities on the record, they will start to stack in such a way that we will impact other metrics such as severity of illness and risk of mortality, which will be scored on a 1 to 4 system in most cases. If you're using the so-called APR DRG system as developed by 3M. There's a lot of moving parts to CDI, and we can't possibly cover all of them in one discussion like this today, but we'll try to hit some of the high points. So, of course, those with higher scores on those metrics, be it SOI or ROM, are clearly more complex, resource-intensive patients, as mentioned earlier. And because we've made a shift in the industry from fee-for-service to value-based payment systems, it's essential that proper documentation is there to support that value-based system utilized. There are other metrics, and CDI programs, even inpatient programs, may get involved with other types of diagnoses that may impact risk adjustment, which speaks to things like mortality and length of stay and readmission risk. And we have some additional diagnoses called hierarchical condition categories, or HCCs. Those who work in the outpatient setting already know the importance of getting proper documentation to support HCC diagnoses for the sake of appropriate reimbursement to primary care doctors and other providers who may be, caring for a more sick population. So, moving along then, we can think about some other key elements before we start talking about strategies that you really want to evaluate if you are going to be able to work in this field and, most importantly, excel in this field. The idea is that you don't just enter the field, but you do very well in it. There are so many great job opportunities out of CDI once you become proficient with the basic operations. You would be astounded as to how many types of careers can blossom out of a CDI preparation. So, risk-adjusted mortality, we've already talked about in terms of patient complexity. We also spend some time in CDI intersecting with quality departments around the topic of patient safety indicators, and hospital-acquired conditions. And sometimes that's as simple as clarifying with a physician or another provider on the case, was a given diagnosis present on admission or not present on admission? You can imagine, for example, a patient who might come to the hospital from a setting of having a neurogenic bladder, uh, requiring a permanent indwelling catheter, and maybe they arrive to the hospital with a urinary infection, and nobody mentions that the urinary catheter is changed out, and only on the second or third day of the stay, somebody might mention there's a urinary tract infection, and they may pass reference to an indwelling catheter that was changed out, but nobody bothers to say for sure that that urinary tract infection was present on admission. And there are other examples where it really matters to clarify if a condition was present when the patient arrived or if it developed in the hospital. And you can imagine why, for the sake of national rankings and other benchmarking elements, that you would want to make sure you have those accurately documented. So many, many different focus points. The quality of inpatient care must be reflected carefully. Remember, primary care doctors may not know why their patients are in the hospital until they read a discharge summary. So you really hope that that discharge summary properly encapsulates all that happened to the patient while they were in-house in the hospital. You'll also interact as a CDI professional with both your immediate leadership, program leaders who tend to use industry standards for guidance on how to run the programs. Both AHIMA and ACTIS are very important organizations that help our industry with the most professional standards and set the benchmarks and also issue the certifications that we'll talk about for this industry. We have a lot to thank ACTIS and AHIMA for as CDI specialists, and those of us that operate in the hospital revenue cycle consulting environment also follow very carefully the guidance put forth by these important organizations. Beyond your program leaders who are following all of those important types of guidance, you also interact occasionally with other leaders, such as those from quality departments, maybe denials management departments, coding departments, and hospital revenue cycle. While you may not meet the CFO on your first day of the job, you may eventually be in meetings with the chief financial officer. And certainly some of the other revenue cycle officers working with the CFO will routinely have tasks and reasons to engage with CDI. So it's quite an interesting and dynamic role that allows you to really hybrid your clinical knowledge and your coding knowledge and all of your background into something that's quite meaningful for patient care. It's not just about paperwork. It's about patient care at the end of the day. So now moving on to some strategies, what would make someone a high-performing CDI specialist? Whether you're new and just wondering, or you're already in the industry and curious as to how you might improve that which you do every day, the essential competencies for a CDI specialist are well worth reviewing here. First and foremost, you must have a strong understanding of the clinical disease process and the underlying pathophysiology, as well as how treatments are, ordered and what the diagnostic criteria are to get those treatments justified. Now, if you don't have a strong clinical background, you can take coursework that can help you understand what are the most important of the clinical findings for each of the different disease processes. I do work and I do see out in the industry plenty of very talented CDI specialists who began their life in a different aspect of health information management, and were not necessarily clinically oriented as physicians or as nurses prior to entering the industry. It is an industry that has a place for those who are motivated and have some related background. So please don't be scared off of entering the industry just because you don't have a clinical job as part of your background. It's only one part of the competencies that you need. And the job is not a clinical job. This is a non-clinical position where you are interpreting data and composing communications to physicians to clarify information. But to do that, you certainly need some good groundwork in clinical medicine uh, to move forward. Now, just in the same breath, what about coding? You really need to have a decent understanding to do well in CDI, in ICD-10, both the CM and PCS components, CM for medical diagnoses, and the PCS procedural coding system for all of the different procedures. They all have very specific codes. There are rules around which codes may and may not be used and what types of information in the documentation needs to be there to pick up those codes. We've already mentioned that those codes then stack up to give something called a diagnosis-related group assignment upon which reimbursement is based, upon which a lot of risk adjustment is also based, because there are different risk adjustment models across different DRGs, and you'll eventually learn about them for the more common types of discharges like heart failure and pneumonia and COPD and others, acute myocardial infarction. And those every fiscal year have some changes. And as they change, CDI standards may evolve and change. So the high performing CDI specialist is the lifelong learner who continues to become more and more proficient in the latest coding guidelines and how they're to be applied. Also, it's essential for you to be a good communicator if you are to work in CDI, whether it's written, verbal, or both. Both types of communication tend to be important. You must be able to engage providers effectively, first and foremost through an effective written communication that clearly delineates that which you're seeking to get clarity on. But you may have times when you have to communicate by telephone or in person for education around the reason that you're sending these communications in, and that will become very important as well. There are ways to speak to providers who don't always understand the purpose of CDI. It can get them to understand why you're communicating with them, that this is a non-confrontational seeking of clarity rather than a questioning of their clinical acumen or anything of that nature. You will have to have great analytical and critical thinking skills to succeed in this field, which means you should be good at identifying trends in data and also in provider response types as you communicate with them. And most importantly, you should be able to use that good thinking to identify where there may be gaps in the documentation that would not translate well because of those gaps to final coding of a case and final billing. So applying those problem-solving skills is something that you'll do every single day in the job and something that you'll be rewarded well for as you develop your skill set. There are also differences in how the Centers for Medicare Services and other private payers, some of the different commercial insurance payers, uh, update their guidelines and update how they like to focus on documentation and final coded data for an inpatient stay. And so that's another whole piece you have to keep up with. Regulatory awareness as it pertains to different payers in the industry. You may also get involved in helping appeal those payers by way of letters when they deny payment for certain conditions, which can affect both DRG assignment and then in turn reimbursement and quality metrics. So many, many hats that you'll wear in CDI. Ultimately, you can acquire a lot of knowledge through studying, through taking boot camps, by taking other coursework. But whatever knowledge you have, you must be able to quickly leverage it so that you have a daily impact of significance. Okay, so early proactive chart reviews are important. CDI specialists are not in the position to say, well, I know about all of this, and I'll wait to see how the documentation evolves. I'm sure the provider will do the right thing eventually and write down something that's useful. You have to be right on the other side of that note being written, scrutinizing if there needs to be a communication to clarify that which needs to be used for appropriate claim submission. So it's a proactive, concurrent, or prospective type of chart review. Uh, some specialty CDI work involves retrospective chart review in conjunction with the coding team, and we can get to that a little later on. You will use the data to engage providers, and you need to use to really have an effective strategy here, real world cases from that provider. Nothing turns off a provider faster from the process of CDI than generic education, laminated tip cards with generic tips that may or may not apply to their world. Using the provider's faulty documentation and politely and professionally explaining how it fell short of the benchmarks used for inpatient coding and final billing of a case really helps a provider understand what they specifically are not meeting in terms of expectations. So it's very, very important that you can quickly turn on a dime and leverage that knowledge into specific applications for specific providers. The next point here is about technology. There's quite a bit of technology available to help you in your job. You're not going to have to become professional coders overnight. The software that you use in this industry does help you get pretty far down the road with setting up some codes. But like anything else, you need to optimize that technology intelligently. You are always going to be smarter than the software. You will always be able to see where something needs to be adjusted because a piece of artificial intelligence or natural language processing has misinterpreted something in the medical record. So this is not an industry where technology is going to replace your job because of all the nuances and subtleties of different providers in the hospital, how they write, how they respond to education. And yet, as much as you have to be careful with that software, it can be your best friend in times of need for running reports, for analyzing your own efficiency or the efficiency of your team, and for helping prompt the types of inquiries that you might be sending. Some of the CDI software will nicely prioritize your caseload for the day and help you understand which cases may have the most potential for CDI intervention. It's also important that you are part of a routine auditing and feedback process. This really helps you with your own work as well as seeing what the follow-up looks like. So if you've trained a provider, they're generally well intended. They'll play along nicely at the beginning with that which you're trying to teach them about. But like anybody else, they will eventually forget and maybe need prompted. So there needs to be a feedback loop in place for you to have regular ongoing communication. That can be as simple as those standard real world case reviews with the provider's own documentation, but then taking the lessons learned from that provider interaction back to your team so you can regroup and think of another strategy that may be a little bit more effective for the more, uh, shall we say, less than enthusiastic providers who need a little bit more of a nudge uh, to buy into the CDI process. And as mentioned before, you'll have to continually stay updated through the lifelong learning process. Now, there are challenges like there are in any job. No job comes without some challenge, but luckily there's always a solution if you're diligent and seek carefully for one. So the first item to really consider here is provider pushback. Providers may feel that queries, which are the name for the written communication that we give to them when we're concerned about documentation, is the query. And providers may have some degree of cynicism or even sarcasm about the queries being all about, quote unquote, making money for the hospital. And while that's certainly not the right way to think about it, as mentioned before, we're simply looking for appropriate reimbursement rather than making extra money for a hospital. Just garnering appropriate reimbursement is the financial piece. Because there are those other quality measures involved, patient safety indicators, and different indices of performance that reflect the quality of care, you may need to edge providers in sort of sideways into CDI initiatives by reminding them of those focus points on safety and quality so that they can appreciate it's about something more than just finance. And even when you do that, there's still some degree of skepticism to be overcome. But it's like any other position. Once you become entrenched, once you develop a rapport with some of the key providers, then very quickly some of those resistances will fall to the wayside and you'll be able to have more meaningful conversations with the providers. We've already mentioned the second point, so we don't need to worry about that one. I've mentioned that the guidelines update yearly and you need to refresh yearly. There are time constraints in this job. This is a high-paced job in terms of the amount of information you need to read. You may, on average, look at 25 to 30 records in a day with quite a degree of scrutiny. So if you can imagine, you're looking at something like 3 to 4 cases an hour over an 8-hour shift. It means that you must be very good at reading quickly, reading effectively, and condensing information so that you can write yourself a quick summary as to where the CDI potential lies on a case. Your job is not to rewrite the entire medical record in one paragraph or less when you make entries into your CDI software, but rather to communicate a brief summary of the case, followed by the areas that look like they may need some CDI attention, so that you can prompt, if anybody else, yourself when you reopen that case a day or two later. Furthermore, you will have to show grace under pressure because that type of work that you do every day in CDI is ultimately scrutinized by the way of audit. The audit process will be undertaken on some of your record reviews and queries sent to providers in a given month period by a member of the team who has more experience and has moved on into a quality auditor role. Sometimes your manager or director will also look at your work. And it's important that you're able to take that constructive criticism without being set back in your confidence level. There's no need for that. It's not as though when you make small errors or you miss certain insights that you could have made a little more deeply, that your job is on the line, particularly unless you are flagrantly disregarding the rules and not trying at all. But if you're putting a decent effort forth, all of that audit process back on your work is simply there to make you a better CDI specialist. So it's important to take those points. That being said, sometimes auditors also make mistakes. And so you have to balance the constructive criticism against also advocating for your original position if you really feel strongly that your insight or your decision making was on point. That's a delicate balance to strike, but your success and your confidence will grow when you stand by your principles. And there will be times when you may choose to disagree with somebody who's audited your work. Also, the other challenge is that some of the query authorship can be quite complicated. Many different areas of the chart to abstract and bring into the record to try and decide how you're going to phrase your question. Uh, Many of the guidelines offered by AHIMA and ACDIS speak to what makes a compliant query, for example. We cannot lead doctors towards a particular diagnosis with too heavy of a hand. Questions have to be posed with a multiple choice answer set that is concise and to the point and allows our providers to use their independent medical judgment when it comes to the questions that you're asking them. And for that reason, industry has created, and your local departments will have created, standardized templates for many of the typical questions asked of providers about their documentation through the query process. And beyond that, you may wish to make your own versions of templates for how you enter information into the CDI software for commonly encountered cases. all in the name of helping your efficiency, because again, you'll be looking at upwards of 30 charts at least in a given business day, some of them more complicated than others. And you'll get to that as you get to learn the job and how to prioritize them. The workflow, moving on to the CDI workflow, you're responsible for most places 12, between 10 and 12, let's say, initial reviews, brand new reviews for you each day of the week that you work. Typically, they're about 2 days after admission because that's when there's enough information to start reviewing. You really don't want to look at a record that only has a emergency department note on it, because the documentation that really counts towards the final coding and final billing starts with the history and physical. So you'd at least want a history and physical to be present on a record, and there will be plenty of those, some with even a few progress notes already up for grabs on your start of your workday. But you'll also have follow-up reviews from your prior work days. And one of your skills that you must master is learning how to space those out so that you do not overload yourself. If you have 12 cases the first day and you try to review all of them again the next day, now you have 24 cases. Maybe you're okay on Tuesday, but if you were to try and review all 24 of those cases again, and add another 12, you get to 36 that you have to review by Wednesday. And you can get the point rather quickly that you're going to have a logarithmically increased workload by the time Friday comes along. So there's a skill set to be learned here regarding follow-up reviews and how to space them out. As you become more well-versed in CDI, you may become involved in post-discharge pre-bill reviewing, where you'll really be looking to see if certain commonly denied diagnosis-related groups could use a little bit more review and a little bit more clarity. And finally, retrospective reviews. There is a period shortly after discharge where CDI needs to come back, look at the record, make sure they didn't miss anything. For example, what if you come to work on a Monday and a patient was discharged late on Friday evening, early on Saturday morning? You may have missed a few notes that may make a big difference to your CDI process and your final CDI assignment. As part of that retrospective process, and in fact, as discharge date approaches, even in the concurrent prospective review, you will have to learn to communicate well with your coding colleagues. Coding colleagues are a wonderful ally and a wonderful asset in terms of the work that we do in CDI. You can have important conversations about unresolved queries and whether it's worth pursuing them still, given the latest documentation. There may be potential queries to consider that have yet to be written. There may be coding nuances that perhaps the coding colleague is better versed in those than you may be, and it may make a final impact to how you process the chart. Chart reconciliation then is a multi-step process. We don't have time to get into all of the things on the screen that you see now, but just rest assured there's a lot of follow-up work as cases are closed out in CDI, and you're definitely going to want to make sure that you remain compliant and check in routinely with your coding colleagues whenever doubts exist before you finalize that record. Certification is the final part of today in terms of information delivery from my side, and I do want to turn the microphone over to you all for your questions. Why does certification matter? It establishes your expertise and your credibility in the industry, and it will allow you, in some instances, to advance in your career. Certainly gives you more opportunities to apply to a wider and more diverse array of job types. And it really helps strengthen the CDI program in which you work when certified professionals make up that team. So many programs mandate the certification, but there are also programs out there that will work with you if you've received some training and shown some interest and done well at interview. with the understanding that you will earn these certifications as you go through in your first couple of years. Both CCDS and CDIP are important certifications. They are a little different, although there's a lot of overlap in the information tested on those certification exams. ACDIS is the organization that sponsors the CCDS, and AHIMA is the organization that sponsors the CDIP exam. The eligibility and renewal requirements for those involve some formal education and experience, uh, and oftentimes continuing education units are required to renew uh, unless you want to take a deeper boot camps, which can give you a lot of additional units as well. Career paths can overlap. CCDS tends to cater towards the clinical side of the CDI job more so. CDIP more with the HIM and coding methodologies, but again, the separation would be a little artificial. There's so much common ground tested between the two. Finally, which certification is right for you then? If there are differences between them, CCDS may be more suitable for you if you're primarily a clinician by training, or if you're already engaged in CDI work and looking for the first credential to really help boost your career. It's a good one to acquire. You should be involved in CDI work for at least 2 years before you attempt to take the CCDS. It's a rigorous exam, but it's a manageable exam for those that have experience in the industry. Also, if you want a credential that's more aligned with the actual clinical operations in the hospital, the provider education you'll be delivering, certainly that's important. CDIP, if you have a strong HIM and coding background already, um, and maybe you already have credentials from AHIMA, RHIA, RHIT, CCS, some of you have mentioned those tonight, and you wish to specialize further in documentation improvement, this may be a more direct route to get involved. There's less of a experience-based requirement for the CDIP than there is for the CCDS. And some people prefer to have that AHIMA-based certification because they imagine themselves going into a broader leadership role in HIM or in hospital admin and may not be as focused on the CDI operational work that happens right there in the clinical setting. So there's many reasons you might choose one or the other, and some people choose to acquire both certifications. So that leaves us just about 10 minutes here for this evening's introductory comments on our CDI apprenticeship, and I'm happy to take any of your questions that you may have now for me.
So this is Alicia.
Hi, Alicia.
So you say the CCDS is more for like teaching professionals
For,
and
for clinical professionals most commonly
right,
who have to teach providers by
right,
way
that's
of,
what I'm,
yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
And the CDIP is more for the background, like the paperwork and stuff like that.
Yes, but that's a little bit, I don't want to sell the CDIP short because there's plenty of important clinically oriented CDI content that's addressed in that as well.
Right. I'm just trying to get the differences between the two.
Sure. That's a good question. HIM operations, those with experience in HIM operations tend to be more likely to gravitate towards CDIP. Clinicians tend to be more likely to gravitate towards CCDS, or those in the industry already reviewing charts as CDI specialists. Thank you for that, Alicia. Other questions I might answer for the group tonight? Quiet group tonight. Okay, well, Most of you were able to reach out by way of, I believe, Facebook or LinkedIn to receive the link to this session. I hope you will continue to reach out to us to learn more about the profession. You can also go to our website where you can learn more about our programs. We do have a number of CDI training programs that we're engaged with at any given time of the year. We run classes weekly, multiple days of the week. So you're welcome to check out our website and learn more about those. And if any of them are interesting to you, you can also use this free consultation link where you're able to go in and pick a day of the week to schedule some time with me. There's no obligation to get onto these calls and learn more about the industry. We don't believe in pressure sales on those calls. It's simply to give you more information that may be specific to your needs. So by all means, please feel free to use that to learn more about our programs. I will open it up one more time for questions before concluding for the evening. And I do thank you all for coming. Anybody else interested in asking anything at all about the CDI programs?
For the remainder of these our webinars, are if we were on tonight, will we get a link for the other ones? Or do we have to ask for each one?
No. So if you've attended today, we have your name and email address, and you'll be continually invited to these as they come up monthly. No need to re-request whatsoever.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. And we will have them monthly. And this is a introductory, being January, we're starting back over with the introductory information, but future monthly webinars will feature additional focus topics rather than the generalities of the field. So look out for the titles and you may find things that resonate well with your interest. Thank you
Thank you.
so much as well. Yeah, thank you for your question, Colleen. Very, very relevant.
I have a question. Do you
Sure.
find, because um like I mentioned prior, I am a CDI outpatient CDI, but I do find I just browse around and look for job opportunities in the inpatient CDI field, but I find that it's harder for someone that's not an RN or a foreign trained clinician, MD, for those positions. On your perspective, do you have you seen any that acts as one of the requirements for you not to be an RN or a foreign trained clinician for inpatient CDI?
Yeah, it's a good question. Certainly the number of opportunities for non-clinicians has gone down over the years. Since 2015, so for the past 10 years or so, there has been a steady decrease in the requests for staffing CDI programs for those who are not physicians or RNs. But that's not to say that every program is like that, nor is it to say that there aren't other jobs within the CDI operational world that would not reward an inpatient, uh, someone trained in inpatient CDI. So there are all sorts of supporting roles in data analytics and in auditing that don't necessarily require that, even when the program requires those clinical degrees for the primary role of CDI chart reviewer. So you shouldn't be dismayed there. And also, despite the decrease in opportunities, they do exist. You have to hunt them down a little bit more aggressively through deeper dives into the different job search engines. And in fact, local hospitals near to where you live are probably the best places to start looking for those types of jobs. You won't find many staffing companies or revenue cycle consulting companies seeking CDI specialists without that clinical background, but you will find some community hospitals seeking to improve the quality of their CDI program, being a lot more open-minded to a more diverse background of applicant.
Thank you. Because
You're
like
welcome.
I mentioned prior, I do work for our large hospital system in New York. I have I have looked into other large hospital systems also in New York, for an example, NYU and Northwell, not ones that I work, but, and even for the outpatient CDI, they are requiring for you to be an RN or a trained clinician for those positions.
Yeah, they oftentimes do, and those are bigger health systems. I'm not so surprised, but I still encourage those of you who are interested and have undergone some training for CDI to still go ahead and apply, regardless of the what's mentioned in the job description, because you don't know what the applicant pool looks like for that facility, and you don't know when a manager is willing to make an exception and go ahead and hire around a particular set of bullet points that you may see. So if you feel that you have the right skill set, I would still encourage you to apply. It doesn't hurt you to try and apply.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Good question. Other thoughts as we conclude for the evening from anybody on the call tonight? Okay, well, if there's nothing else, thank you again for attending. We hope to hear from you by way of these consult calls or simply by email. You're all welcome to email as well. So all the contact information is there on our website for you to find. Thank you again, everybody, for participating. Have a great night ahead, and I'll look forward to hearing from you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.